rather than me giving another speech, much better just open it up to questions. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, either electronically or the old-fashioned way, Maddie and I'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can.
All right. I think we've got Carol with her hand up if you want to go first, and then we've got one in the chat we can go right to.
Okay, this is Carol. The continuing resolution ends on March 14th, which is next week. And do you have any prediction of what is going to happen with that legislative process?
Well, Carol, as you know, I'm terrified to make predictions because I'm usually wrong. I just told Maddie before we went on the air that I thought the Kansas City Chiefs were going to win the Super Bowl. So I'm just not making any predictions in the slightest. But what I do think is worth watching for, and because I think the question's a really smart one, Carol, is the Democrats are in a particularly difficult spot here because they are understandably concerned that even if they agree to a budget deal, they point out to the DOGE cuts and say, how do we know that the administration would honor the agreement that we come to with them? On the other hand, I think they're very worried that if they withhold their votes, they vote against it, and the budget doesn't pass, then the government shuts down. And they worry deeply and understandably that one, that would cause even graver harm to government employees than some of the DOGE cuts do. But they also worry, also with some justification, that a government shutdown would not be all that bothersome to Trump supporters and to their agenda. And so the question the Democrats are wrestling with right now is, do we vote against the Trump budget because we disagree with it? Even if that does risk a shutdown, which could cause even greater harm. And I've listened to both Senator Schumer and Representative Jeffries on this, and I don't get the sense that they've come to a clear conclusion yet. On one hand, they can justifiably point out that Republicans are the majority party. Why can't they pass a budget? But they end up in a partisan back and forth about whose fault it is. And if there is a shutdown, it still leaves them in the same substantive challenging position. So I don't mean to put this all in the Democrats' lap because the Republicans are far, far from agreement, either on a continuing resolution, let alone on a full annual budget. There's huge differences between the House and Senate and within both chambers. But in the immediate, this is something Democrats are going to have to decide. Do they put up the votes despite their best judgment in order to avoid a shutdown? Or do they push back against something they abhor, even if that's the risk? And I wouldn't even venture to provide a prediction on that one.
All right. Thank you, Dan. I do want to ask this one in the chat here. And Don, do you want me to ask it? Or you can come off mute.
Sure. Okay. I ask you for another prediction. But do you think that that Trump will continue to provide military and intelligence support to Ukraine if peace negotiations continue more than say a few months?
Well, so it's a great question. In other words, we know that Trump is willing to withhold this military aid until Ukraine enters into peace negotiations. But what if those peace negotiations aren't settled right away? I believe, and again, I don't want to make a prediction on it, that I believe that if Trump's administration saw what they consider to be a good faith effort on Ukraine's part, even if the negotiations didn't conclude in peace, I suspect you would see some of that support return. But the question that's ultimately going to come up here is whether Trump and his administration are going to ask anything of Putin at all. That's a point that the Europeans are already raising, and what Zelensky is already trying to do. He's put out, as you've seen, sort of a partial peace proposal. He has suggested that both Russia and Ukraine cease their warfare at sea and in the air. So it's not a full ceasefire, but it's a major step. Putin and his government have not yet responded to that. If Putin refuses that, I don't know if that's enough for Trump. But I think if protracted negotiations take place, I think Trump will see that as progress. But I say that without a lot of confidence.
All right. I have Michael's hand up next.
Who has the best backdrop of the night?
Okay, you're right. My question is capitulation of Trump or deference of Trump to Putin. As a refugee from Germany in 1938, I saw the capitulation of what Chamberlain did with Hitler. And do you think Trump's deference to Trump is more of a personal as opposed to a real American policy? What is it good for Trump if Trump settles it for Putin? What's in it for him?
So I've seen, Michael, I've seen three theories on this. One, which I know all you've read going all the way back to 2016, is the idea that Putin has some kind of dirt on Trump, whether it's photos that are compromising or something like that. I have to believe that if such things existed, we would have seen them by now, but who knows? So that's one option. I think the second, which I think is more plausible, is that Trump, whose view of politics, is seen through a pretty absolutist lens, tends to admire those leaders who assume a great deal of authoritarian control. I'm just going to take you back for a minute. It's going to sound like I'm changing the subject, but I promise I'm not. It's a great book written by Michael Kranish of the Washington Post called Trump Revealed, in which he talks in that book about how young Donald Trump, as a young man, was taken by his father to meet with a ward boss in Brooklyn by the name of Meade Esposito when they needed approval for projects and that kind of thing. And it was very clear that if anything needed to happen in Brooklyn, that Meade Esposito made it happen. And so what young Donald Trump saw was his introduction to politics was as an absolute authoritarian figure who could make things happen unilaterally. And I think there's a plausible case to be made that when he looks around the world and sees a Putin, sees a Xi, sees others with that kind of all-encompassing control, he admires it and wants to share in it. So if option one is that Putin has some dirt on Trump, option two is that Trump simply admires the strength and authority with which Putin leads. But the third one to keep in mind, and it's not mutually exclusive of the first two, is Trump has made it pretty clear, I think we've all heard, Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And whether it's ending the war in Ukraine or ending the war in Gaza, he wants to be seen as the person who brought peace where nobody else could. And I think he believes, perhaps in concert with one or both of those previous options, he believes that the best way to end the Ukraine war is to give Putin what he wants. If we have time, we can talk about Gaza a little bit later too, because I think his thinking there is somewhat similar. But I think any one of those three options could be a plausible explanation for this predisposition that Trump does seem to have toward Putin.
Thank you, Dan. I do want to get to one of the questions that we have in the chat. John, did you want to ask it or do you want me to? So I can read it if you want, which is John's question was, do you think that the reconciliation process will produce something untenable for the Democrats?
That's a much easier question than the first ones I've gotten, John. Thank you very much. The answer is yes. But it's yes, comma, going back to what I talked about earlier. I think the Democrats are wary of a government shutdown. I think the Republican congressional leaders understand how wary the Democrats are of that. and they intend to use that as leverage. What gives the Democrats a chance here is to see if they can split off some Republicans. In addition to a few ultra conservatives who will never vote for a budget, you've got a number between 15 and 20 what are called so-called frontline Republicans. These are Republicans who were elected in seats either that Harris won, districts that Harris won in 2024, that were extremely close between the two parties. And these members have already a number of times gone to the Speaker, Mike Johnson, and said, you can't ask us to vote for some of these things because it will cost us our reelection and it will cost you the majority. So if the Democrats are smart, very smart, they'll find a way to peel off some of those votes, or at least threaten to. If not, I suspect you end up with the reconciliation process that really is something that they don't find tenable and resign themselves to fixing if they reclaim the majorities in 2026.
All right. I see Roger's hand up next.
And I will say that if Michael has the best backdrop, Roger clearly has the best rugby shirt of the night.
Okay. Yeah, there's so many questions, but I'll get it down to one here. If Trump doesn't honor court decisions, he's got so many executive orders going in front of the courts now. What happens if he doesn't honor a court decision? What recourse is there?
Oh, it's exactly the right question to ask, Roger, and it might be the most important one. And this came up in a slightly different way during last month's webinar in February, when someone asked, are we in a constitutional crisis? And I said I did not think so, at least not yet. And what would cause that constitutional crisis is if the Trump administration refused to direct court order. Now, there's already some lack of clarity on a couple of the court orders, whether the administration is adhering or not, but there does at least right now seem to be some gray area there. I think if Trump were to simply declare, no, that's the Supreme Court's opinion, like Andrew Jackson said, a long, long time ago, they ruled on it, let them enforce it. If Trump were to take that step, a full frontal pushback, then I think that crosses the threshold into a full-on crisis. Trump has indicated that if the courts rule against him on these questions, he'll be unhappy and he'll appeal, but he'll abide. But I think as much of it as anything we've talked about tonight and in past programs, this is the key question. So I'm glad you raised it.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. And I see Melissa's hand up next.
You're not going to believe this. I had that same exact question, but I think that it was very well asked. So I moved on to a different question. I'm just wondering if our trading partners, the tariffs are on, then they're off, then they're on, then they're off. I just wonder if there's a through line with the stock market or with just people's patience. Is there some kind of breaking point in that? I mean, it's hard to say, but I just want to get your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important domestic policy question we're facing right now. And I know we talked about Ukraine and Israel last month, and now we talked about Ukraine tonight because we really had to. But at a certain point, I really do want us to do one of these programs on economic issues, particularly trade and tariffs and inflation. And this is the question, because it's what we're already seeing from the stock market is, regardless of what investors think about tariffs, the lack of predictability is having a real discouraging effect. And we're already seeing layoffs starting in the private sector because employers just aren't sure what to expect. And to me, and Maddie, unless something else comes up, which of course it will, we should try to make this our topic for next month, because I think this gets at the core conflict within Trump. He's a businessman, but he's also a showman. And in the latter role, he loves drama. And he knows that the way to cause drama and gain attention is by creating suspense. The problem is investors don't like suspense. And so I think right now he's learning on an hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis. You heard him say in his speech last night, there might be some discomfort, which is his acknowledgement of this. I think what he's learning on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis is that the unpredictability is causing him more problems than the policy is. The other aspect of this, and this is where I thought you were going, is with our trading partners as opposed to investors in this country. Clearly, they have a very strong interest, perhaps even a stronger interest in maintaining these trade relationships than we do. And that's Trump's core gamble. He knows that a trade war will hurt the US, but he knows it will hurt Mexico and Canada and China and other countries much more. And so what he's hoping is that they would have to back down because of the pain that would be caused them before the US would have to. But I think what we're already going to see, and there are signs of this emerging in Europe, is that more and more of our trading partners, should this continue, rather than going isolationist themselves, will simply expand trading opportunities to other countries rather than ours. And we're already seeing that on the Pacific instead of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You're seeing many of these countries, including China, expanding trade with each other without the US. And so the question is, do the markets convince Trump that drama shouldn't be as high of a priority as investor confidence? And to me, that's the literally $1 trillion question.
Super insightful, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then we've got Jim up next.
Yes, thank you. So many things that I would love to get into, but I'm thinking back historically, Dan, before Newt Gingrich became Speaker. I recall both parties would come to a budget agreement, and that would be it for the life of the Congress. We didn't have this month-to-month budgeting that, you and I, paycheck to paycheck, that so many of us do. Am I wrong there, or do you remember that as well, that we didn't use the budget as a cudgel and a weapon? They actually tried to solve the nation's problems rather than, forgive me, this nonsense.
I agree with you for the most part. I don't think that the confrontations very rarely ever got to this level. But I think one of the things us old folk tend to do, and I count myself among that, is we tend to look at the past through rose-colored glasses. And there's no question that in an earlier era, we didn't reach this stage of government shutdowns happening on a near constant basis. But back when I first got involved in politics in the 1980s and long before that, there was no shortage of politicians in both parties who would use the budget as a weapon to achieve policy goals, budget related and otherwise. So Jim, I think you're exactly right. It's become much more pronounced, it's become much more heightened. Just the way society has become much more divided, more polarized, so has the budget process. But I'd also be careful about overly idealizing how the two sides worked together back when the earth was young.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, I do want to get to this one in the chat, which is it's from Jeff. Jeff, do you want to read it, or do you want me to?
I can read it. I've heard from friends in Washington, where we used to live many years ago, that they are expecting that Trump may not care about getting a budget, but will try to do a budget by executive order by emergency and rule without one for the rest of the budget year. What's your thought on that hypothesis?
Well, like you, Jeff, I lived in Washington a long time ago also, and I'm guessing that you don't miss it there any more than I do. But what I will say in answer to your question is I have heard those rumors. I think there are those inside the White House who would try to convince Trump of that attack just by governing by executive order. This will be yet another test for Republicans in Congress because you have any number of Republicans, particularly those who are defense hawks, who argue that a continuing budget line on defense is inadequate. And they have a very strong incentive to push for some type of budget resolution, if only to increase defense spending. Now, most of these people probably like NATO too. So we're probably, this will be another in a series of tests in terms of their loyalty to Trump. But I think if he were to try to do it, there'd at least be potential pushback, not from Democrats, but from Republicans on the Hill. But if this were a path he decided to take, it would end up in the courts. That goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier. But I do think it's the type of thing where we might see more resistance from Republican leaders also. But I don't discount it at all. I think it's a very live possibility.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Carol, got your hand up.
What do you think Mr. Netanyahu is feeling about Mr. Trump and or his staff negotiating directly with Hamas?
Oh my gosh, Carol, there was actually a quote from the Israeli government in the media this morning, and I don't have it in front of me, but it was something along the lines of the Israeli government noted that the U.S. has spoken directly to Hamas, and we have communicated our thoughts to the U.S. government. So it wasn't those exact words, but it was about as chilly a sentence as you'll ever see in an official communique. So they're obviously very, very unhappy about it. The question now for Netanyahu, and I feel like we've begun sentences like this almost nonstop for as long as we've been doing this program. The question for Netanyahu is, you saw what Trump's follow-up message was to Hamas. That, look, either release the rest of the hostages or hell will rain down on you, which White House advisors explained as not a U.S. military attack on Hamas, but rather a green light from the U.S. for Israel to re-engage very heavily. And so the question for me is not whether Netanyahu likes what Trump said or not, but whether, given that green light from Trump, if he will re-escalate militarily or not. I think as much as Netanyahu does not want this war to end until the hostages are free, I think he's also concerned about escalating it, which is why we had at least a first phase of ceasefire. But let's assume that Bibi realizes that being Donald Trump's friend has both its benefits and its costs. But to me, the most important thing to watch going forward is how he responds to the essential carte blanche that Trump has now provided him.
Thank you so much. And then Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Dan, if you might agree that Trump is the exact opposite of Teddy Roosevelt, who once said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And Trump, I think, is saying, speak loudly and carry a soft stick. And I'm wondering whether he might be the most dovish president in our history, that he doesn't want to go to war against Russia. He doesn't want to go to war against China. And he might go to war against a small country like Panama, where he has overwhelming support. But my thought is that he is a dove.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to rank 47 presidents in terms of dovishness. So, but I think your broader point is the right one, which is it's notable that with the exception of the U.S. sanctioned assassination of Soleimani in Iran during Trump's first term, he has avoided military conflict, most notably with Iran and Syria, even while speaking in a very aggressive and confrontational way. It's been a while, I have to admit, since we've heard a president espousing the Monroe Doctrine, but here we are again. And going back to what I said earlier, I think Donald Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and that he also recognizes that given this country's growing isolationist leanings that we've talked about many times earlier, that his election to a large degree was predicated on a vow to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. So between a campaign promise, number one, and his personal goal, number two, and perhaps, we don't know, a personal aversion to military conflict, to me, of the three, that's the least apparent, but might be an additional reason. I think you're right. He speaks much more confrontationally than he acts. And I will just say, and I hope I'm not proven wrong, I would be astounded to see a pronounced US military attack on either Greenland or Panama over the next few years. I think what Trump likes, whether it's in those cases and others, is to issue threats and force compromises that are on his terms. If someone calls his bluff and agrees to fight back, we'll see what happens. But his MO seems to be threaten the fight in order to avoid it. And I'll get back to you with that 1 to 47 ranking for next month's program.
All right. If any last questions before we close it out?
Janice comes to the rescue. Excellent.
Hello. Trump alleged in his speech this fraud and abuse in the Social Security system. I've been hearing things like he's going to have DOGE actually interfere with it, stop the payments, that they fired thousands of agents, Social Security agents. They've stopped the organization or the bureaucracy that hands out leases to Social Security Administration offices. And what's your opinion? Would they interfere with Social Security payments, with Medicare, do you think?
The director of Social Security actually spoke out today warning about DOGE possibly acting in a destructive way. It wasn't clear whether he meant intentionally or unintentionally, because of course we've seen DOGE take some very dramatic actions that they very quickly walk back already to date. Trump has made it very clear. This is one of the ways in which many ways in which he deviates from traditional conservative orthodoxy. He's made it clear over the course of 3 campaigns that he doesn't believe in entitlement cuts. I think one of the reasons that he's been so much more successful with working class voters than Republicans historically have been is because of that commitment. And I think that that's something that resonates with him. That said, the line between waste, fraud, and abuse on one hand and eliminating necessary benefits on the other, that can be a pretty murky line. And so to what extent he will allow some reductions that he is comfortable identifying is waste or fraud is an unanswerable question. I don't think you'll see the kind of sweeping Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid overhaul that sometimes gets talked about because of his campaign commitments. But if Trump can be convinced that there are some reductions that can be made without harming benefits, but just targeting this waste and fraud, I think he'd sign off on it if for no other reason that, as we saw in the first Republican budget that passed, there's no way for them to get to a balanced budget without touching entitlements or defense spending.
Right.
So my guess is we see some reductions, and whether that's the type of thing that is generally waste or fraud or causes genuine pain to real people, I don't pretend to know. I assume, as an observer, that there is waste and fraud in the system. I assume that there are people who want to cut the system way beyond that waste and fraud. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't know where in between those two extremes the line comes. But if he wants to get to a balanced budget, he's gonna need at least something from those buckets.
Okay, thank you.
And Maddie, did we notice that there were an awful lot of predictions asked for tonight?
Everybody wants to hear your predictions, myself included.
Tim just emerged as a latecomer in the best backdrop contest. That's pretty impressive.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, I'm assuming that Maddie is saying that I'm okay to ask my question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. It's great to see you. And I absolutely love listening to all the comments and questions. you're pointing out that Trump is a showman. Couldn't be more accurate from my perspective. I loved his 90-minute feature film the other night. I'm waiting for the sequel. And I'm really wondering whether or not people like that have the feeling about our country that I do, and it seems like the folks here understand that I think we're still missing the point. I mean, Donald Trump literally spoke to call it the blue collar high school graduate. And there's a whole bunch of them, and they vote for him. They don't mind having 7 and 8 kids. Give me a little bit of pain. I'll suck it up and I'll go back out and do whatever you need me to do again. Whereas we keep missing the point because we come at it from the scholarly perspective of, oh no, $8 million is such a small fraction of the overall total budget that it's nothing. But $8 million is 8 times the amount of the average American's entire life earnings. So we need to get, from my perspective, we need to dumb it down. I am one of those people that you point out, I'm looking at just doing the local community things to say, okay, I'm an outdoorsman. So the Department of Agriculture and Interior is being decimated. So we're doing things, working to try and keep campgrounds clean and available over during this period of time. But you know something? Our camp is growing because these people that voted for Trump are starting to recognize, well, that was not the smartest thing that could have been done. So we're just ordinary folks, common sense, saying, okay, let's not make that mistake again. So I'm getting back to all the folks that are here. Last point that I'll make is that I've always wondered what happened to the 21 to 45-year-old white males. You look at the group we have here, it's predominantly white and senior. I mean, we've got to reach the audience that are making these decisions. And by doing that, at least from my perspective, we start small, we go local, we go Congress, and we work our way back till we have a message that resonates with the majority of people. That's it.
Tim, several points, and I'll pick up on 2 of them. And then unfortunately, I'll apologize to Sid and Sandy because I think we'll need to call it a night at that point because we've gone a little bit over. But Tim, I think several good points. What I'd say is number one I want to address is the only thing I'll quibble with anything that you said is the word choice on dumbing down. Because I think the voters who you're talking about, they're not dumb, they're busy. And so when I was talking earlier about picking one single issue on which to concentrate, to me, that's not recognizing a level of intelligence, but rather a level of bandwidth. So if we say simplify instead of dumbing down, I think you and I are absolutely in lockstep. And it's not simplifying to denigrate anyone or to think less of them. But I tell my students this, and I used to tell my candidates this. I said, those voters who frustrate you because they don't pay enough attention, there is something in their own lives that is just as important to them as your campaign is to you. And respecting that difference is the key to gaining their respect. So I think you and I are in the same place. I just offer a word choice. And as far as younger people, I would say with the exception of the remarkably boyish Jim Grant, I think you're exactly right. We are, many of us, the men on this call anyway, are a bit long in the tooth. But I'll tell you this, Richard mentioned earlier a program that we did on Tuesday night, and we watched a documentary on Benjamin Netanyahu, and I had the privilege of moderating a panel discussion afterwards. After the panel was over, a young man came up to me and introduced himself, who is helping to run the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall Young Professionals program. Because I'm old, I thought he was only 14 years old, but he assured me he was actually in his 20s. But the fact that Maddie and Krista are working this hard to put together a young professionals organization, I think is not only important for this organization, I think it's vital for its future. And I know I leave it to Richard to usually do the shameless pitching. I'm going to be writing a check to the World Affairs Council earmarked for that young professionals program, because I think just as you do, we have to prepare our next generation of leadership. So I couldn't agree with you more. I know I tell this to you every month, but as much as I enjoy the webinar, I like these sessions so much more. I used to call them the post-game show. Now, as Maddie tells you, I call it the after party. But either way, it's just a really, really neat conversation, smart questions, and I can't tell you how much we all appreciate you guys participating. So we'll look forward to seeing you again in April. And I also know that Maddie and Alexander are working to move forward on hybrid programming that's going to be available both online and in person. So even while Roger is watching from South Carolina, for those of you who are a little bit closer, hopefully we'll be able to do this in person at some point in the not too distant future also. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a great night. I look forward to seeing you again soon.